Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 8th of July. Today we're looking at a lot of smaller updates from various parts of the front line, whereas in some of the videos from this week there have been larger advances in very specific points along the line of contact. Today we're just seeing a lot of videos from throughout the front line indicating rather small changes, but by the end of the video I will of course discuss the missile strike. 40 plus is what's being reported, 40 plus cruise and ballistic missiles that were launched towards Ukraine, and we're going to get into some of the specifics around which cities were impacted. But let's of course begin by looking at some of the videos that were released, first from Ukraine's 15th Karadag National Guard Brigade. And so they released this footage over here just to the northwest of Verbove, and it shows how they were able to destroy this Russian Desert Cross ATV, which we've seen utilized further westwards around robotyne. That's where it's a lot of its utilization on the Zaporizhia front. Now it's being expanded to this area westwards around Novomykhailiva, and of course BMP-2s as well. And so the BMP-2 was eventually abandoned by the Russian garrison inside of it, the Russian squad. So they got out and retreated to the nearby tree line, which you see marked over here in green as you see it going southwards. And so this was the vector of the Russian attack, which allowed their forces to advance, if we're measuring it out, about 700 meters westwards. And at that point, they encountered the Ukrainian resistance. And so again, the Ukrainian National Guard unit here, they are purely on a defensive footing, trying to maintain control of the hinterlands between the Russian line of contact and suburbs of Orikhiv, such as Malotokmachka and Novodanyalivka, because they want to prevent any sort of Russian vector coming along some of these important paved roads from the southeast. That is the main objective of the Ukrainians here. And there have been a few intermittent increases in clashes here further eastwards in areas around Huliepoli, for instance. But if we could just look at the Russian troop composition over here, it's indicative of a lack of interest so far in any sort of major activation. And so the way to tell if there would be any shift in that regard would be to look at the sort of units that are involved, whether there are fresh units that are moved into the area. But for now, I just don't see that. Going a bit eastwards, we now have a video that was released by the 79th Air Assault Brigade. Again, this Air Assault Brigade is still defending previously in Novomykhailivka, now at the approaches to Kostyantynivka. They released this footage which shows that the Russian forces did slightly advance in this sort of plot of land just to the southeast of Kostyantynivka. So they had this rather large armored assault, one of the largest that I've seen from this entire theater. And they advance, of course, along this paved road, a kilometer of an advance along the salient, and then a parallel attack along this tree line. And so it was a combination of Russians using armored fighting vehicles, MTLBs, BMP-3s, T-80s, for instance. So just a cacophony of vehicles altogether for various usage, including targeting Ukrainian strongholds in the region, quickly reaching a point and then dismounting troops. It's all part of a concerted effort that the Russians try to embark upon to take and over and occupy certain Ukrainian positions, probably within the village itself. But they were able to reach this outer approach where there's a Ukrainian trench. And so that area is now under Russian control, but they were not able to advance any more to the west here. And so this is a different video from the 79th, because also in late June they repelled an assault here. But on July 8th, they were able to destroy around 14 Russian vehicles in this area. And so it was a rather large sort of response utilizing, mines, because this area is also littered with mines, FPV drones, artillery, drones dropping grenades onto Russian soldiers that got off and dismounted in some of these tree lines here. And so it's confirmation of the large-scale Russian efforts to finally get a foothold within the village, but also of how the Ukrainians are still trying to defend in this area. Now looking northwards at Krasnohorivka, the urban battle here rages on. This time the Russian advance that was noted amounts to about 150 meters northwards, as the Russian forces were able to capture this soccer field, if you zoom in on it, and also this track field over here, larger one. And so the Russian forces, now they developed this sort of vector, which is in a region that's very important because you have this local park that I'm marking in light red here, and that's sort of the dividing line between the Ukrainian line of contact and their final apartment, hospital, higher elevated positions on this eastern flank, and then some of the private residential areas that are located here to the west. And so having control over the national park and of course all of the concealment in whatever is remaining of the foliage, it is important for the connectivity of the Ukrainian companies defending here. And of course, if we look at this western region, it is also a key because it allows whatever force is present there to then expand northwards and westwards towards the remaining Ukrainian suburbs of Krasnohorivka. And those are the final houses that the Ukrainians have solid control over east of the Vovcha River in this particular area of the front line. I won't say, I can't really stress it enough, because if you zoom out, you see there's just square kilometer upon square kilometer of land that is east of the Vovcha River here that is just completely an open area. A lot of it is located on really low elevated areas because of the tributaries that are sort of branching out in these certain regions, and they're just not fortified. And then again, supply lines are also very difficult to maintain here. You have a few of them leading into Krasnohorivka, as we can see, but it does become difficult. Whatever's remaining of Krasnohorivka is rather isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian defense line east, or I guess west of the river, that is being built right now. And so those western portions of Krasnohorivka really are the final strong points for the Ukrainians there. Now, looking further north at Avdiivka and generally at the Vovcha River front, it's interesting because today Ukrainian sources reported on a rather minor Russian advance. I guess I'll just mark it for you guys with the ruler over here to show the extent of the gains. It's just additional Russian clearings. In terms of an advance, it's just infantry on foot that are gradually pushing along the same road that they used to get into Sokil, to then get into Avdiivka and the nearby Ukrainian trenches. So this time they advanced 200 meters, and they are getting very close to these defenses here. And then there is a question about whether the Ukrainians are even capable of defending here. What we have seen them do, though, is actually send in a Bradley near Avdiivka. In terms of when the actual video is recorded, I don't know, but the published video is from July 8th. And so it is relatively close to where the Ukrainian mappers said the front line to be, but it is a bit deeper into what is now imagined to be Russian-controlled territory. But again, the situation is very fluid, as the Russians only this week entered areas like Voskod and eastern Avdiivka. And so the Bradley was here. It entered a firing position trying to target the Russian forward operatives in the region, and then they were hit by FPVs. And so I don't know, because the video cuts out before it's clear if it actually did incur any damage, but that should give you an idea of how the Ukrainians are still trying to remain proactive here and still utilizing the 47th Mechanized Brigade after all of its engagements in Sokil. It's now going to defend on the front foot in Pokrovsk and Vovcha. Moving on to Chasiv Yar, we are really hearing more of the same. This general narrative that the 98th VDV Division, Russian unit, of course, they are just continuing to clear out the remaining Ukrainian pockets or remaining gray zone east of the canal. And so an area where that still has to happen is in this zone that is just southeast of Chasiv Yar and south of the canal, and also protrudes into some of the forested area. And these regions are important because they also include this local embankment that you can see marked over here, which does give control of nearby areas where there could be battles in the open. And so those areas are also fortified, and no longer can the Ukrainians use them for their forward line of defense, but they are still using the embankment just to the west of the canal for their defensive purposes. And that's a part of why the Russian DRG operators are so active in the areas, the physical parts of the canal, the area where there is no longer this sort of water going through the ground, and it actually enters into a pipeline which is above ground. And in those areas, it's much easier for the Russian forces to cross over towards the, I guess, Ukrainian side of the canal and target whatever defenses or positions in force they have. And so that's where the Russian DRGs are the most active, also because of the concealment, of course. And so they are just trying to solidify control over there, as we've said previously. And we also have this new video, which is from July 8th as well. And it shows the Espanola detachment, which is a Russian FPV crew that's been very active in this sector of the front line and also around Avdiivka earlier on. And so here they hit, I don't know why it says Russian, it should be a Ukrainian Cossack armored personnel carrier. And so the two Ukrainians that were operating in it, they got out before it was hit, and they were retreating towards the western side of the canal region. And so you could see how this area has become a gray zone with some Ukrainian forward echelons still trying to keep the Russians at bay. Now moving on to the Kupyansk Front, I just want to remind everybody that the 41st Mechanized Brigade, a unit that was at least partially here, perhaps also some of its battalions in Chasiv Yar, it was completely moved to the Toretsk sector either this week or last week in order to, of course, assist with the defense in that region. And that may have played a role in the Russian forces being able to spot a gap in the Ukrainian line and then, of course, exploit it. And that's what we saw with some of the videos that we discussed from early June and then going into, let's see, like late June, early July period, where the Russian forces were able to advance from their forward operating post in Vilshana, which is a difficult area to hold because it is on a valley overlooked by the Ukrainian ridges to the south. But they were able to advance throughout this 1 month period, 2.5 kilometers southwards, nearing one of the Ukrainian ditch defense lines, because really the Ukrainian defenses here are based off of ditches that extend out of the suburbs of Kupyansk in this portion from Petropavlivka. And so they're rather close to one of the first areas where there's actually houses that the Ukrainians are storing themselves in. And then here we have another report from July 8th of a Russian advance, this time amounting to 1.3 kilometers southwards. And so with just continued Russian pressure here, some Ukrainian sources mentioned that the Russians succeeded here following a strong airstrike barrage, probably consisting of FABs. And so this area is a region that would make sense for a lot of these airstrikes because you just have Ukrainian forces out in the open here. There's not as much fortified structures. They're just located in tree lines or within dugouts in fields. And so it's just easier to spot them and then, I guess you could say, target them specifically. And so this Ukrainian defense company in this region, whatever force they had here, was subjected to rather strong air preparation and then, of course, artillery before the Russian forces advanced here with a couple of vehicles and made their way to this part of the field, this tree line over here. And they are now, if we measure it, about 1 kilometer or 900 meters away from the ditch east of Petropavlivka. Now we have to discuss the recent Russian uptick in these deeper strikes, whether it be from air or just through ballistic missiles into Ukrainian territory over the past week, beginning in early July. That's when we saw this massive uptick in Russian footage being posted of ballistic missiles hitting air bases. And so it just became a very common theme every couple of days to see a footage from reconnaissance drones that were flying above Ukrainian airspace and got very good high-resolution videos for hours upon hours of these air bases in order to help fix the strike for the missile crews that were launching the Iskanders. And this, in many cases, they were targeting these regions in eastern Ukraine, or I guess east of the Dnieper River. For instance, Migorod was hit. Poltava, I believe the airbase over here was hit twice in rather quick succession. And of course, in these strikes, they're targeting out in the open Su-27s and MiG-29s and other such Soviet aircraft that were stationed out in the open, which did, of course, lead to many of them being damaged in such strikes. And then the biggest issue would be the fact that the reconnaissance drones were able to get this high-resolution footage for so long without being spotted or being shot down by Ukrainian air defense in the region, or, of course, without any sort of interceptions on the missiles that were launched towards these air bases. It wasn't just towards these regions that are east of the Dnieper River, but also around Kryvyi. You had here a strike on Dolzhin-Tsevo. I think that's how you say it. There's also this airbase, which is just east of Kryvyi that was targeted by the Russian side. And so, yeah, you had just this period of just continual Russian attacks, and then the Ukrainians just being unable to intercept any of those specific targets. And then you also had specific videos being released of claimed destruction of air defense systems. Even today, there was one where the Russians claimed that they were able to destroy 3 HIMARS launchers. And in the video itself, first of all, it's a thermal imagery, so it's very hard to discern anything. And it's also so high above in altitude, and in terms of, for instance, the resolution not as good. And so then it makes it much more difficult to determine if it was actually a HIMARS launcher. Basically impossible from my perspective as somebody who's not an expert on the matter. But that's what they're claiming, and it does seem like there were 3 vehicles, whatever sort they may be. I have no idea, but there definitely was a strike on something here, and so it does display once again the Russian capability of striking deep into Ukraine, and then raising the issue of lack of air defense coverage, because you could have one, I guess, medium range air defense battery that's stationed in between Mikhailov and Poltava to deal with both of those air bases. And you do have some anti-aircraft units that are generally operating in these areas. I may have to pinpoint them right now because they're not on the map. But then that raises the question, what about the other 20 plus air bases that the Ukrainians have, where they're going to have to source some of the F-16s in the future? And then what about the dozens of major cities that Ukraine has, both on the front line, which is currently the biggest priority, where you have a lot of air defense systems that the Ukrainians still maintain diverted towards to prevent the Russians from, of course, being able to use FABs with just total impunity. So they have to move their air defense closer to try to target some of the Su-34s that are flying within Russian airspace, just to try to disincentivize such attacks by the Russians. And so, yeah, that diverts, of course, air defense systems away from air bases. And also, you have to deal with the fact that some air defense is stationed in frontline cities and then also in rear cities, both east of the Dnieper River and even going into western Ukraine, especially around Kiev, for instance, or in an area like Dnipro. It's particularly important. But, in Kiev, it, of course, makes the most sense because, it's the administrative center of the country. A lot of very important military, business, governmental targets located here. And just in terms of a sign of not political projection for the rest of the world, it is important to have here air defenses. And then, of course, for the millions of people living here. And so there's also a concentration of air defenses here, which, of course, diverts attention away from the air bases. But even with whatever batteries are stationed here, whether it be NASAMS or Patriots, we did see today that there was a large concerted Russian strike, which consisted of, cruise and ballistic missiles. I don't think there were any Shahed drones involved. And what's most unusual is how these were daytime strikes. Again, most of these Russian strikes over the past few months, even with their uptick beginning in March and then their gradual decline, and now, of course, the increase, we've seen it usually occur rather late at night, midnight, past midnight. Those have been the hours. But then hearing reports in the early morning and then going into the noon of the 8th of July, hearing reports of, 6 Tu-95 bombers being airborne in the Caspian Sea, and then other bombers being active in the Black Sea area generally, or within Volgograd, just east of Ukraine, or generally in some of the oblasts northeast of Ukraine, having, MiG-31s being airborne. Just those sort of reports. Or, for instance, Tu-22s were also mentioned as being active this past day, and they were the ones that launched the Kh-22s towards Ukraine. And so it was unusual given the time of day because it did happen in broad daylight, and that's when we saw a lot of videos, and there's no way to filter those videos, and so it just came out very quickly for everyone across the world to see, especially within Kiev. But let's just remember that it wasn't just on Kiev where there were targets struck. We also saw some of the cruise missiles targeting Kramatorsk and Slavyansk over here, but I'm not exactly sure what they were targeting. I know, for instance, in Kryvyi Rih, where there was damage, it was reported by the local administration that it was towards an administrative building of an industrial enterprise in the city. And then in Dnipro, there was also damage incurred. Maybe I'm mistaken, but the latest data that I've seen is that there were 10 killed and 31 wounded in Kryvyi Rih, and then 1 killed and 6 injured in Dnipro. But of course, as you dig through the rubble, the number does increase like it did increase in Kiev and Dnipro here. What I saw from Ukrainian channels is that there was damage incurred to a residential building and into a service station. And then you had DTEK, of course, the Ukrainian company, the energy company, reporting that there were 3 electric substations that were either damaged or destroyed. And so then it begs the question where they were damaged, whether it was in Dnipro and Kryvyi Rih, where it's pretty likely, or also perhaps in the Kiev area. So let's actually give to Kiev now, because you did have 40 plus missiles being launched according to Zelensky, and a large number of the Kh-101s, the Calibers, the Kinzhal cruise missiles, whatever they may be, targeting the city itself. And so looking at the areas that did incur damage, and this is again based on the point of view of the Ukrainians filming it and then extrapolating from that the geolocation of the strikes. And Ukrainian people that were recording videos themselves also talked about this. One of the areas that was targeted was the Zavod Artem building. And again, Artem is this rather large Ukrainian firm that does produce a lot of this defense equipment. You could say like interceptors, air-to-air missiles, ATGMs, for instance, spare parts for aircraft. And so it does have a wide variety of production uses. I don't know if this plant was actually active at the time, if it was really producing anything, because first of all, in 2022, it was hit very hard. And then I believe it was in March of 2023, there was also a strike here which caused some damage, blowing out the windows. And since then, it's been under some sort of repair process, but it may have been fully repaired and operational again, which is why the Russians decided to strike it again this time. And in terms of the amount of missiles they expended, it's between 5 to 7 here. In a lot of the videos, you could see between 5 to 7 smoke plumes. That's generally what I've understood from the videos. And so that's a large amount to be fixated on this one general region on that facility, trying to make sure that the Ukrainians could no longer utilize it going forward. And that's probably after they did sort of damage assessment of their previous strikes. And here's just one geolocation of just a point of view of Ukrainian citizens, civilians that was just filming in the area to the northwest of the building that was struck. And then measuring just south, let's actually look at how far away it is from the general complex that we talked about with the Artem facility. About 1 kilometer south, there was a missile strike. And let's actually pinpoint the exact area where it occurred. Generally in this courtyard region in between this building over here, which is the toxicology building. It's referred to within the wider hospital complex as building number 3. And here's the larger Okhmatit National Children's Hospital. And so it hit, I guess, the majority of the visible damage that you see besides the courtyard is in this bottom left section of the toxicology building. And then you also see a lot of the windows blown out and some damage to the facade in this nearby building over here just to the left, and then also in the main building here where you have the large entrance where you saw a lot of the civilians and coming in, flooding in to just assist with the rescue efforts. And in terms of the amount that I last saw that were casualties here, it's I believe 2 people that were killed and then 16 people injured. But again, people continue to get found in the rubble. Even until now, while I'm recording this, there may be people that are still, and that's just gruesome to think about, they're still buried under the rubble here. And so then the big debate that was spurred is whether the missile that hit here is a Kh-101, which would be a part of that general barrage launched by the 2 95s towards this part of Kiev, towards the Artem area, and then at least one coming towards this area over here, a kilometer south. And then some people on the pro-Russia side began to say that it may have been an AIM-120 interceptor from the NASAM's air defense system, which is also present generally here. And you had, of course, the PAC-3 and the NASAMs going off to try to intercept some of the missiles that were launched by the Russian side. And so I'm not an ordnance expert by any means, so I have no clue. I don't even want to try to give my own opinion on it because I don't have an informed one. But it doesn't, at the end of the day, what we do see here is that there was damage to this toxicology building. And then the question is, what else could be here in this region? And so there is this substation, which I would assume connects to the broader hospital plant. And so the point of the substation and the generator there is to just provide electricity to the actual hospital itself. And it's located right next to the toxicology building. And so that's important to keep note of. In that concrete reinforced building where you have the substation located, it's an area that was also suffered significant damage in the attack, but the general concrete structure was not destroyed by the strike itself. So annually, this hospital treats about 20,000 people, and it is a pediatric hospital. And they also conduct thousands of surgeries over an annual basis. And since the beginning of the war, they have moved a lot of their operations underground into basements to try to avoid any sort of nearby shelling. And so now this has definitely caused some damage more generally. It's of course mostly concentrated in the Korda area, but then it also expands it outwards to the nearby buildings, and so that is a setback for them. And then of course the human toll is horrible. I believe that in total, in the entirety of the strikes, it's the official count from the Ukrainian side, they're saying 37 killed and over 170 injured. And it is absolutely important to see which munition, which ordnance was used, because it does have implications for the information war that's being fought right now. It has implications for all the diplomats that are now coming to this site, and they are going to, deliver public addresses and sort of shift the opinion within their own countries and within whatever sort of legislative body they have in their own countries. And so in that regard, it is actually significant to look at. I'm just not the person that has the ordnance expertise to give the definitive answer. Now, looking a bit into the bigger picture, the Ukrainian Air Force, they claim they were able to intercept over 75% of the missiles. And this is very weird to me because at least in one clip we were able to see in Kiev, those 7 smoke plumes rising, those were 7 direct hits by the Kh-101s on the Artem area generally. And that already contradicts the claim made about how many Kh-101s the Ukrainians believe they intercepted, because they say that they intercepted 11 out of the 13 Kh-101 cruise missiles. But clearly it is higher than that based on the video footage that I have linked, and that is just generally circulating, published by Ukrainian WhatsApp groups and telegrams. And so that's definitely the case. In general, the Ukrainians say that they intercepted 30 out of 38 missiles. Again, that's a bit weird because Zelensky most recently said that there's been over 40 missiles fired. And so, that's larger than 38. It could be small difference, but regardless, it is a difference nonetheless. And then we could go through some of the other claims made by the Ukrainian side, not necessarily because we have to believe the percent of interception, but because then we get an idea of which ordinances were used in these attacks. And so, for instance, they claim that they were able to intercept 1 out of 1 Kh-47 M2 Kinzhal ballistic missile, and then they were able to intercept, they say, 3 out of 4 Iskander M cruise missiles. We saw some of them active here. They said that they were not able to intercept the 1 Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, which was utilized. I'm very interested to see where that actually ended up hitting. And it has been previously used on Ukrainian buildings within Kiev earlier this year. The Ukrainians also say they intercepted 12 out of 14 caliber cruise missiles, 0 out of 2 Kh-22 cruise missiles, which is weird to me because I do believe that they launched more than just 2 Kh-22s during this barrage, and then 3 out of 3 Kh-59/69 cruise missiles. And so, yeah, just keep that in mind. Make your own decision as to what seems to be the most realistic number, because based on the footage we saw, not just from Kiev, but also from other cities like Dnipro and Kryvyi Rih, and based on the Zelensky statement, for instance, that there were over 100 different buildings or various targets within Ukraine that incurred some damage, then that definitely has to be kept in mind. But yeah, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.